Okay, let's go. So thank you so much for the chance to speak with you today and to share what we've been learning so far as part of the research fellowship that I've been doing with Arantzazulab. And thank you for the introduction, Yona. So I'll start by giving us an overview of what we will cover today. So the first thing I will do is introduce the research. I want to talk a little bit about our approach and why we chose to do the research the way we did, and of course, why we think this research is important in the first place. The second thing I will do is take us through the findings, so what we have found so far. There's a lot more work that we can do, and there's a lot more research that will give us even more knowledge, but we've already found a number of very key insights, so we'll share those with you today. The next thing I'll do is share the hypothesis. So from all of the research that we did, we have come up with a hypothesis, and what we'd really like to do with you today is share that and test it. Then the fourth thing I will do is talk a little bit about what we plan to do next. So the program of work for the next 6 months, roughly. And then lastly, I'll hand back to Yona and to Nayera, and this is where we will ask you for your help. So we will be asking questions like, what do you think about the hypothesis? What resonated from the research? What do you think didn't really make sense, or you didn't really think was in line with your experience? So we'll hand that back over to you at the end of the session. So let's get started into the research. So back in January, we asked ourselves a very simple question. And the question was, where has transformation happened on the ground? So we weren't talking about hopeful transformation. We were talking about transformation that had actually happened, where it was led by a community or by communities, or it used some form of collaborative governance. And what we wanted to find was local and international examples of this kind of transformation. And so why did we want to ask this question? Why was this of interest to us? And it really stems from the fact that as a global society, we have really reached a point when we're thinking about challenges like climate change, like economic disparity, human inequalities. When we're thinking about these big topics, they're really just too complex to solve individually. And so what we wanted to do was to find other people, other organizations, governments, really anyone who had successfully gone through a transformation. And we wanted to understand how and why their initiatives worked. Now, many of you will have your own lived experience, and we also found this in the literature. It's not possible to just look at what someone else is doing and copy it and put it somewhere else. And so what we wanted to do in the third point on this slide is to take, it wasn't to try and copy, it wasn't to find amazing examples and then try to do them locally or vice versa. It was really about saying, can we take these research findings and can we work with the Basque ecosystem, so people like yourselves and others who are not in the room today, alongside of an international ecosystem where the people are really interested in creating change, but by working through ecosystems and through multiple stakeholders and collaboration. So that's why we asked this question. The research had two clear objectives, so two places that we really focused. The first one was on understanding the transformation landscape. And so what we mean by that is we wanted to understand, when you look at transformation, what are the different actors, what are the different roles, what are the different conditions that are necessary for that transformation to occur. So it's a very broad understanding of the landscape. And then we wanted to dive deep into specific examples. So we have 14 examples that we've looked at inside. And what we wanted to do was understand how, in these examples, how were they governed, who was financing them, what was their management structure like, how were they organized. They're the two focused. I'm just going to stop for a second. I'm getting, is the sound okay at your end? I can see you're walking to the front.
Yeah, we should turn one of the microphones here, but I think it should be fine now.
Okay, no trouble, but you're okay. You're all hearing me. That's fine. I just wanted to check it wasn't someone trying to interrupt me and say we can't hear you. Okay. So we've got the 2 research objectives. And then in terms of our approach, so there's 3 key elements to the way we did the research. And the first one was really focusing on interviews. So the types of people we've been interviewing are those who are really trying to or have been successfully doing transformation initiatives already. We've done about 30 interviews and it's growing, and the more people we speak to, the more referrals we're getting, and so this will continue to grow as we go along. The second place we focused was on desktop research, and so we've looked at many reports, many publications. We've been looking at scientific literature, but what we've also been focusing on in this desktop research is really looking at the human experience of transformation. So what we know is there's a lot of exceptional academic literature, and we're working in the Basque ecosystem itself to make sure our research connects with local work. But we also wanted to really focus on what does it actually look like and feel like on the ground when people are trying to do these initiatives. So this means our desktop research has also looked into, I guess, less traditional spaces. So we've looked a lot at blogs and a lot of opinion pieces of people who are at the leading edge. And lastly, we've been gathering feedback. So we have been publishing everything we've been doing all along the journey. So we've been publishing blogs, we're doing presentations like this one. And at the end of this month, we'll have a gathering where we've invited people to essentially come in and critique our thinking and also to help us break the hypothesis if we need to. So let's get on to the results. So what we've learned so far. So just to give you some orientation, the results I'll talk about now just focus on this understanding the transformation landscape. We'll talk about the other one in a second. So what did we find? The first thing to say, and the very obvious thing that we found from this research, is when we looked at the examples where transformation happened, we consistently saw one type of actor that was almost always present. And this actor was playing a very key role in convening, co-creating, hosting, and organizing lots of different stakeholders. And what we really learned is that in terms of how we think about these types of entities or these types of actors, we have a lot of language around them. So we call them systems conveners. That's one of the terms that's in the literature. So systems conveners are always present. This is what we found. But we have this language that we use around them throughout the literature, but also through people's experience is very vast. So sometimes they're called ecosystem builders, sometimes weavers, sometimes connectors. You could even think of labs and accelerators and hubs and incubators as all occupying this same kind of role. And we think that the very fact that there's so much language around this type of actor is really an indication of how important it is in transformation. So if you were to take away 2 things, it's that the language is quite important. It's showing us that these systems conveners are important and that the system conveners are always there. Now, when we think, the next thing we found was that size and scale were absolutely critical elements of transformation. And what we tended to see is you would see systems conveners or transformations that were successful, let's say at a city level. So you would see this really great example, and then multiple cities wanted to be involved, or perhaps it wanted to scale or spread to a region. And what we found is that really didn't work very often. So whilst these initiatives and these transformations work very well at the scale they were designed for, they very rarely were able to get much bigger or to go to other places. And what we started to see is that this part of the challenge and part of the reason they weren't scaling and spreading particularly well is because as the initiatives got bigger, they needed different kinds of organization. So you need to organize maybe 3, 4, 5, 10 times more people. And you needed to make more and more complex decisions with more and more stakeholders. So the governance structures and the organizational structures really didn't hold up when you tried to make the initiatives bigger or spread them. And so this really flows into this slide here. So when we looked at systems conveners and we looked at transformation, there were 3 key challenges that consistently showed up. So this first one I've been talking about, this was the bridge to this slide. So when these initiatives are successful, and I think that's the sad part about it, is we most want to scale something, or we most want to spread something when it's worked. But what we were finding is that as these things got bigger, they had to hire more people, they had to bring on human resources functions, they had to become very formal. And so they created institutional structures that were like the very system they were trying to break. So they ended up becoming what they were trying to transform. And that was similar for governance and decision making. So when these transformations were smaller, they had very, I guess, traditional looking governance structures. And that wasn't a big challenge. It didn't really cause many issues. But as they had more diversity, if we take this example where it's 1 city and then it goes to 3 or 4 or 5 cities, those traditional governance structures really started to not hold as it got bigger. And then lastly, around funding. So with these kinds of initiatives, what we tended to see is they were funded by public funds or they were funded by philanthropic funds. And they were generally funded for a period of time, so say 3 to 5 years. And after that, there were very limited sources of ongoing and sustainable funding. And so what we started to see is people would go, these transformations or these systems conveners would go for grant funding, so project-based funding, or they would try to invent business models, but then that ended up making them business-like. So these are the big challenges we saw. And from the human experience side, we saw quite a lot of richness. A lot of this detail is in the blog, so I'm not going to go into it today, but I just want to pull out 2 key points. And if you want to go deeper, a lot of this information is published on the Arantzazulab website. The first one I want to point out is about a vision. So almost all people we spoke to and most of the literature talked about having a common and shared vision as being very important. But there was a real tension in the research, and it's still unresolved at this point. And I think that's because this is one of the big challenges we're grappling with globally, is whilst a vision is very important and whilst a vision is really kind of critical to have people come behind and to move towards, there are very big questions about how the visions are made and the fact that the visions are not necessarily democratically created, and that at a certain level, a common vision doesn't really have a lot of, people can't feel a sense of belonging or a connection to it. And I guess a good example is the European Commission has a set of visions and a set of ideas that it thinks are important, but how that actually operates at a city level, there's these huge disconnects. And so there was a lot of focus and a lot of conversation around this topic. The second thing that I think is quite important to mention here is that whilst we never asked a direct question about leadership, it didn't exist like that, but almost everybody talked about leadership. And they talked about it in a way that really seemed to redefine the type of leadership that's necessary for transformation. So the words that were used were humility, humbleness, no ego, and they talked a lot about needing to be okay to do work where we don't know if the outcome will be what we think. And so I just think these were two things I wanted to raise in this conversation today. And as I said, there's lots of detail in the blog. So if you want to have a look at the others, that information is there. So let's switch to the other side. So that was the landscape, that was the big picture. Now let's go deep into some of the examples. We will make this publicly available. You don't need to read this, but what I wanted to show you is some of the work and how it looks in the back end. So we have 14 examples of all the different initiatives that we've looked at. And there's a series of questions we asked ourselves. So what was the initiative trying to address? Where was it? Why were we interested in looking at it? How was it organized? Who funded it? So all of that information is in this table, which we will put out into the world so everyone can have a look at the raw details if they want to. But as a summary, these are the 14 initiatives that we looked at. Again, I'm not going to go into all of the detail here today. I'll just handpick a couple. But this will be the topic of the next blog that's due to be published as soon as we possibly can. And we're working very hard. So I guess hopefully this is a teaser. So you want to go and look at the next thing that we publish. So let me pick a couple. So El Sistema is a very interesting example. It uses music as a way of transformation, driving transformation. It started in Venezuela, and its ambition, or its kind of catchphrase, was, we want a violin in the hands of every child in Venezuela instead of a gun. Now, the reason we were interested in it is it's become quite wildly successful in Venezuela, and it has actually expanded globally, but it has done so in an extremely disaggregated way. So there's no central coordination or control. And so this gives us a lot of clues about what the advantages of being really, really just spread out and everyone can do what they want, very distributed model. And it gives us a lot of clues about what's bad about that. So there's pros and cons. So this is a good example that we're looking into. If we take the Sea Ranger service, so this is really about protecting the oceans, and it started as a very traditional looking not-for-profit, but they have really transformed their business model over the past couple of years and have started to use concepts like franchising as ways of driving transformation and social impact. So the way that it's looking to fund itself is entirely in a business model way, even though it's a not-for-profit. So this one is quite interesting, especially given all of the other ones on this list have public funding. So that's one of the main reasons we looked here. There's another one I thought would be quite useful to mention specifically today, and that's the Wikipedia Foundation. So if you look on this list, most of these have an element of being place-based. So they're local activities in local places. And these are critical. We know that these are critical for our thinking. And we wanted to look at, well, what are examples that are not necessarily place-based? And so the one for Wikipedia Foundation was quite interesting because the way Wikipedia as an online, purely digital community works is any person who's in that community is able to put forward a proposal for something that they want to change. And a particular person put forward a proposal which said, I don't think Wikipedia should accept cryptocurrency because cryptocurrency is unethical and has a lot of environmental concerns. And what happened, and what you can see, because there's an immense amount of transparency, absolute complete transparency, you can see every vote, every comment made by every person in the entire course of this decision. You can see how that decision was enacted. And in the end, Wikipedia chose, because one person in their community suggested this, not to accept cryptocurrency because of ethical and environmental reasons. And I think that's quite an interesting example to put into the mix. Now, if we move on to what we found kind of at the meta level, one thing that was a little surprising actually is when you look at these examples, these 14 different examples, they actually have fairly standard governance structures. So they almost always have a management team, a governing board, and an advisory board. And what we started to see was at the very kind of highest level, so the highest level of hierarchy, the governance was very similar to any governance that you would see in most places. But where we were able to interview people and ask them deeper questions about how did it actually work, there were much stronger articulations. So people really kind of didn't talk about the governance per se. They talked a lot more about capabilities, mindsets, and kind of substructures. And we found this to be really quite an interesting piece of feedback when trying to think about our hypothesis. What was also quite interesting is for each of those initiatives, if you look through all of this, they all have 300-page documents. And most of what people talked about in this middle, which was really the success factors, very little of that showed up in the written material. So there's something happening here where the reality on the ground isn't necessarily showing up where you would expect it to show up. We also found that most people only have part of the puzzle. So at the outset, we imagined that we would probably find examples where people had thought about all of the same things that we were thinking about. And in the end, that's not what we found at all. We found that individual examples are part of the puzzle, but not all the parts. And some of the things we found that were very, very useful to us is there's a lot of information about support structures. There's a lot of information about helping citizens be involved in the decision-making, but there's still some questions we have about this. I raised this before about a shared vision or a shared purpose. There's a lot of information around that, but a lot of questions still if the purpose or the vision is too high. We started to sense that there's this real need for legitimacy, and we're asking ourselves the question, how do you balance legitimacy and innovation and emergence? And the other, I guess, key part of the puzzle is we have found very limited examples of innovative business models. So far, this hasn't been something that shows up very often. So they're the findings, and we took the findings and we transformed them into our hypothesis. And so the hypothesis is that for transformation to occur at the size and scale that we need as a world to address things like climate change, decreasing trust in governments, these structural economic disparities, all of these big issues that we have, we need institutions and governance that is future fit. And everything that we have seen so far, there hasn't been a good balance between how to maximize local cultures and local structures and have that connect up or connect through or connect out, it doesn't matter which direction, probably all directions, we haven't found a way to connect local work and planetary in a very good way. We haven't found any examples of this. So we need to reimagine it. The second one is we need to fundamentally reimagine how we fund this kind of work. Project-based, consultancy-based, membership-based, they have huge limitations and are a big inhibitor to transformation. The third part of the hypothesis is that, just so I can make it quite clear, we're not suggesting that systems conveners are the only people doing transformation. That's not the case. What we're seeing is that they're very often at the forefront of making transformation happen. And so we think that if we work with these systems conveners who are already acting at the local level, we can gather, these are the people who are bumping into these challenges every day. They hit number one, they hit number two, they bump into them all the time. We believe that if we can learn from them, we can create a better future design. And then lastly, the hypothesis is we think there are new roles that we haven't even imagined yet that probably need to exist. So this is the last slide for me, so I'll just go into next steps. So I have shown you today everything that happened before here, so all the research that got to this point. And now we're in the feedback phase. So just as a bit of feedback, some information for you all, we have had a number of people reach out to us as a result of publishing this work. And we have been getting really interesting and very strong, very good feedback about it. So this has been quite good. And of course, we want to hear your feedback and other feedback and work from there. At the end of this month, we have the gathering that I mentioned. So this cohort of a small group of people who will come together and help us break, reformulate, test the hypothesis. With this refined view, so with all of this feedback, we will do another 4-ish months of research, but with more focus. And then the intention is to host an international conference in November, not very big, but with real leading edge thinkers who are really tackling these challenges that we have found exist for all systems conveners and for most transformation. And so then the last part for today will be breaking up into groups, and Yona and Nayara will explain this, but what we want is your reflections, and particularly your reflections on the hypothesis. What works, what doesn't work, what would you add, what would you subtract? And so I just want to say thank you. Particularly thank you to Nayara and Yona, who I think have shown exceptional leadership on this work. This work is asking very tough questions that don't have a lot of answers. And I just want to thank them both for creating this space and for being kind of brave enough to step into a space where there's more questions than answers. So thank you.
Nico was asking about the time, that he doesn't see the element on timing on our hypothesis, and how sometimes like initiatives or like this type of work, it's a little bit of an evolution or time in order to generate that impact. So if you have any thoughts on that, and I think we had that into the like insights. So maybe you want to share a little bit of that timing and the timing reflection that we captured, and how that might link to the hypothesis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, brilliant observation. I think time was absent in the presentation, but certainly wasn't absent in the research that we've been doing. And one of the most interesting examples we found was the National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia. So there is now a policy in Australia where there's a very unified way. If you have a disability, there's a very unified way to get benefits and services from the government. And anyone who's been involved in that process will say, actually, it's been 20 years in the making. And actually, there was a lot of change between who was leading the transformation and who was following. And so they said, for example, at the beginning, it was activists. So disability activists were agitating and, being activists. And then the government made steps. And then the government led programs. And then this worked, and then activists would say it's not enough. And so there's this element of time, which I think you've identified. And I think there's also this element that depending on where and when you look at a transformation, there will be different actors, different roles, different leaders, different experiences. And we haven't yet found a way of really bringing that into our specific insight. So we have it, and we're working on it. So I guess I would ask the question back, when you break out into groups, if you have any thoughts or ways that you can imagine we can bring this further to the front, we would be very open to hearing it. And Jonna, also, you wanted to connect it to the hypothesis. So if you want to also add, please feel free to add.
Challenge accepted with the timing. We will take it to the exercise.
Okay.
We will have the conversation here, and then we will share with you what has been discussed.
Thank you.